Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're looking at this extraordinary subject of the near-death experience, which is associated with a transformative vision. And by transformative, we mean that the vision changes the person that has it. And the episode can occur to anybody. You don't have to be spiritually advanced for it to occur. It can occur quite unexpectedly. It has been something that we have anticipated, certainly over the last 40 years. We are approaching the dawn of a new age. And by that we mean the end of the bimillennium, the end of the 2,000 years, and the beginning of the third millennium. And we have been promised as esoteric students, as people who follow ancient wisdom and try and apply that wisdom to our present day, we have been promised new religions. And these new religions are beginning to show themselves. Some of us, forewarned, knew about their coming and prepared the ground. This is true of our subject tonight. I was talking on out-of-body experience and the near-death states to universities in America, to audiences, to festivals all around the world. The effect of this, of course, was to persuade the few people that I reached that there was a new religion pending, but along comes science itself. And to our amazement, my amazement, it has been science that has established with great certainty the coming of these new religions. Quite remarkable. You'll hear this story unfolded here tonight. One of the new religions is obviously going to be associated with the environment. We call this the green movement, where people on the planet are becoming deeply concerned about the way in which our planet is being misused. And one of the new religions will be associated with the green movement. Maybe not under that name, but certainly it will involve attempts turned into a religion, so sincere, so deeply thinking are the people concerned, turned into a religion to help reverse this trend of planetary abuse. And so you will see one of these religions emerge centered around the matter of planting trees. This is going to become worldwide. Our children, our grandchildren are going to be affected by these teachings, and you will find that large masses of people will go out at certain times of the year and they will plant trees ceremoniously under cycle, under close observation of natural conditions. And so what I want to stress here at the beginning of my talk is the emergence of religions that are going to be based on something entirely different from what has been the fact in the centuries gone by. We're going to be building religions around the natural energies of the earth, the natural energies of the planet, the energies that we call color, sound, magnetism. These energies, part and parcel of our planetary framework, are going to be employed in the new religions. Already we're finding that the symbols of the old religions are wearing out. They are wearing out. In fact, in Britain, the church symbols are practically worn out altogether. It's true also of Europe. I have spoken many times in the last several years in Rome, the seat of Roman Catholicism. And I have spoken there to audiences, and to my amazement, I discovered the immense unpopularity of the way in which the Christian religion is being presented in citadels of its nature, which are like Rome, Paris, and elsewhere. People don't like the way that it is being presented. We are perhaps tired of the old images which have been associated in the past with frank cannibalism. Take this. This is my blood. Drink this. Take this. This is my body in Holy Communion. Based on cannibalism, pure and simple. We have a manifestation of the karma of cannibalism today here in Britain. We're hiding it under the concept of mad cow disease. But that disease was known certainly 30, 40, 50 years ago when I did medicine. It was taught at my medical college, and it was found that the condition arises or has arisen in human beings in the past who were headhunters, who ate the human brain and died. In many instances, whole tribes died out. And this condition is related to the karma of cannibalism. I don't want to put the fear of hell up you, but we need to consider some of these factors tonight. And indeed, there will be an opportunity at the end of the talk for you to ask questions. Very recently, and I'm referring now to the Arab-Israeli War, the 7-Day War, the attention of the medical profession was focused upon the matter of what constitutes death. It arose because during that war, which was mainly tank warfare, going out into the desert and fighting battles there, leaving those who were wounded and slain behind because it was difficult to remove bodies in the heat of battle, there emerged some extraordinary factors. And the most important of these was that many men left on the battlefield for dead had been somehow able to crawl into some place or the other in what we call a wadi or a donga, and there to recover. And it seemed, according to the medical men in the army investigating the whole phenomena, that we hadn't known at that stage of science, anyway, during the 7-Day War, what really constitutes death. And the matter is important because, as you well know, doctors are expected to recommend occasionally transplantation of an organ. And if an organ is going to be removed from a person, then the doctor must know that that person is really dead at that moment. And so there has been this focus of attention on the eschatology associated with mankind. And by eschatology, we mean those events leading up to death, the death act itself, and what follows. And embraced in all this is this extraordinary matter of coming close to death, and during that period of being virtually clinically dead, an experience is had, a vision is had. What do we mean by clinical death? What do we mean by clinical death? Standard procedure is to look for these things. That if the heart has stopped beating, that would indicate a death state, but there must also be no rhythms being produced by the heart, electrical rhythms as it were. There must be no brain waves given off. The eyes must be dilated and fixed, and therefore the person is virtually blind. And the effect of all this is that you can decide whether a person is clinically dead. In the old days, we used to put a mirror in front of the mouth to see that there was no breath coming from the mouth. And so there are certain clinically accepted signs of death. But now we have an extraordinary development in the scientific world in which people are being trained to rescue those who drop down dead. A person drops down dead in the street with a heart attack, perhaps has a stroke in his home in which a blood vessel in the brain breaks, bursts, and there is hemorrhage and a stroke, and the stroke kills. The criterion of death that I have just mentioned to you would have to be applied by the doctor to ascertain whether the person was dead. Also, people die in hospital. They die on an operating table. Something goes wrong with the anesthetic. There's panic. The heart stops beating. There are signs of clinical death. And while they're rushing around to, as it were, rescue the patient, the near-death experience occurs. And so you have a person dropping down dead on the pavement in the street. Along come a specially trained group of paramedics, and their effect on rescue is very profound today. They are experts at the work, and many, many people are now being rescued who would normally die on the spot. But when the rescue has been effected, when the heart is restarted by various methods, the strange thing is that many of the people who have been clinically dead for 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes talk about an experience that they had while they were dead, while they were near to death. We don't like to say that they were dead, even though all the clinical signs indicated that they were. They report an experience during the 5 minutes or so of clinical death. They talk about being in another world, a world that they can touch and taste and see in with as much reality as this one. There's no question in their minds that this was a dream. It was something different. They were alive, they were out of their bodies, they were in another world, and they had the sensory organs functioning in order to perceive that that world was as real as this one. Well, that's what we're talking about here tonight. And we need to know something more about these experiences, which are often associated with an extraordinary vision. And the vision changes the person for all time. And so this is our subject, and we need to look into it with care. You might say to yourself, well, it's all hearsay, but history records many, many thousands of instances of people who have believed to have died and have recovered. The 7-Day War that I described a little earlier was very profoundly affecting medical observers because of advances in medical science right up to this day. They were given the opportunity of investigating what is expressed by the death state. But I want to read you a little excerpt that I took out of a South African newspaper, I'm sure you will remember it, on the 6th of January this year, 1996. And it reads this: London. Farmer's wife Daphne Brooks was recovering on Friday in a British hospital after being left for dead in a body bag and taken to a mortuary. Undertakers took Banks, 61, to a hospital in Huntingdon, in eastern England, in the early hours of New Year's Day, after she was declared dead at her home by a doctor. Hospital spokesman Margaret Markey said, mortuary workers were about to load the body into a refrigerator when they noticed signs of life. and called a doctor. Banks was found to be breathing, and after intensive care is now recovering. Her resurrection came as a bit of a shock to the hospital workers. Obviously, they are intrigued by it, but very glad that it has had a happy ending. Well, the British medical profession was approached about it, and they told the BBC the incident was a simple error and was unlikely to be a disciplinary matter. One must wonder how many people have been very close to death and may even have been buried alive. We've got to face up to that fact, that there are many instances of this kind of experience being had. Now I want to talk about the wherewithal of what you possess when you die, and also what happens after death or during the actual death state. You and I are very aware, being interested in esoteric matters, that the physical body is only the outer shell of man's nature. You know as well as I do that the physical body is interpenetrated by a force field of what the Theosophists would call etheric substance. By that we mean it is made up of subatomic particles, mainly those particles which science calls neutrinos. Clouds of neutrinos make up this ether body of man. And these neutrinos are very hard to detect, to measure, because they are electrically neutral, and they are also have no mass at all. And so it's very difficult for science to detect them. Nevertheless, we know that they're there. They form a body with its own physiological actions, and this body's main work is to pick up what the yogis call prana from the sunlit atmosphere and to circulate it around this etheric body. The purpose of the etheric body is to supply vitality to the brain and to the spinal cord. This is the province of the yogis. They have demonstrated its existence many, many times. And you and I are very well aware of these yoga processes which are associated with spiritual development. And this is important to note here. The process of yoga is one in which you focus the energies of prana into force centers called chakras. These are located on the spine, and spiritual progress is a process spread over many lives in which you take the energies of these chakras by various yoga means and you concentrate them in the head region. You concentrate them in the head region and the person becomes a saint. He reaches towards the end of life expression, a kind of perfection that Plato called truth, beauty, and goodness. And it is in this state that people achieve enlightenment. Very important from the point of view of our subject here tonight. So this is the etheric body of man. But it is not the main concern here in this lecture. What we are more concerned with, another much subtler substance, a subtler substance called emotional matter, or to use the parlance of the esoteric, we call it astral. And we have got an astral body made of emotional substance. We must point out that the physical world that we know so well is interpenetrated by an etheric world, a counterpart of it, in this etheric substance, mainly of neutrinos, and we have, as you have seen, an etheric body within that world. But we're concerned with a much larger structure, the so-called astral world, that interpenetrates our physical planet and extends for an immense distance, almost 200,000 miles out into space, reaching almost as far as the moon. This astral world is the world that we move into under certain conditions. It is a world that we can move into if we are able to detach the astral body from the physical. Let me tell you something about this astral body. It is a body made of emotional substance. It interpenetrates the physical and takes up a likeness of the physical body. Your astral body is very, very like the physical body that we know so well. The function of the astral body is to take up emotional energy from the astral world and pour it into the personality. We call this emotional creativeness. I have an astral body that feeds me with emotional energy. So have you. We use our astral bodies to be expressive, to make our personalities have drive and forcefulness in the world, and for them to be able to express in creative acts this emotional energy. Whether you're an artist, whether you are giving a lecture, whoever you are, you require emotional energy. Most of you know that if you can't get emotionally involved in something, then you find it very hard to drive that project forward. You need emotional energy. And the emotional energy helps to hold the personality together. Now that astral body fits snugly into the physical. When we fall asleep, however, an extraordinary thing happens. The astral body, if we're lying down, the astral body will detach itself from the physical and come to lie just above it. Perhaps I can risk a crude drawing to this effect. You're lying in bed, or you're lying on the street pavement with a heart attack. There you are. And the moment that you fall asleep, your astral body slips out of alignment, and its normal position is about 2 or 3 inches above the physical. When it is in that position, the astral body can recharge itself very rapidly. We all get emotionally exhausted during the day, as you well know. We get emotionally exhausted, and we need a good night's sleep to recharge. In order to recharge, the astral body is able to draw in emotional energy very, very rapidly from the astral world, providing we have fallen asleep. Sometimes during the sleep state, we have experiences which are out of body. How do they occur? How is it that the astral body not only can come out of alignment, but can move off into the astral world, a world that is very like our own? The astral world has been created by man. When we emotionally express ourselves, we give off that emotional energy. We take it in from the astral world, usually through a force center called the solar plexus chakra. We circulate it in the astral body, and we express ourselves emotionally, and the effluent of that expression pours out from the surface of the astral body. The effect of millions of people living on the planet emitting emotional effluent from what we call their auras is to create an astral world. And so the emotional beings on the earth create the astral world by their emotional experiences. And that astral world is not only a structure made of very subtle substance, but it also is more or less a photographic structure mirroring the images in this world. And if we have an emotional experience in which we argue with a family or with a group, that image of the argument is conveyed into the astral world. And so we say that the astral world is thrown into compartments, millions and millions of compartments. And in these compartments, there's a scenario there. there is a scenario which is very similar perhaps to the one that you live in on the earth. The people you know, your colleagues in the office, the people who are your family, they're all represented in one of these compartments. And when you're out of the body in the dream state, you automatically drift towards one of these compartments. When you do detach from the physical body, we call it out-of-body experience. Most people are unaware that during the night they have had an out-of-body experience. If, however, you undertake a course of spiritual disciplines, it is possible to remember the out-of-body experience, especially if you can lighten your sleep, make it less dense, less heavy. And so there is this extraordinary astral world, mainly like our own, but different in some instances. The astral body's main function during everyday life, though, is to give us drive, to give us the capacity to do things in the world. And so we talk about 4 desires that are expressed through our astral bodies. There's the desire for security in the world, and your kids learn about this when they go to college or university. The desire for security, which makes you look for a good job to secure your family. There's the desire for response. I will love you if you love me back. And if you don't love me back, I'll tear your jugular vein out. That's that kind of emotional love, which is characteristic of the astral body. Then there is the desire for new experience. The kids stand on the streets today and get into trouble because they are bored stiff. They are wanting new experience and can't get it. So that's the 3rd desire. And the 4th desire, expressed by the astral body, is the desire for recognition. I want to be something in the world. I want people to understand that I have certain gifts and talents and capacities. And so we try and express these. Now here comes the important point of it. If during the day you have been frustrated, if you have not had the emotional response from the one you love, if you have had quarrels with the boss and you detest your job, if you are bored stiff and are not getting new experience, and if you are not recognized in the world or for what good you are, then you're frustrated, and when the end of the day comes and you fall asleep, the astral body comes out of alignment, it is frustrated, it can't get the desire in the physical body in the waking state, and so it will enter the astral world and try and satisfy those desires in the astral world. If you can enter the astral world conscious and know that you're there, then you can deliberately project yourself to any part of the astral world. And we call that astral projection, the ability to take over your consciousness and to deliberately move yourself around in the astral world, finding out persons, places, things that will satisfy your desire. Then there is the last state of out-of-body that we need to know about, and that is the death state. When we die, the physical body can no longer be retained. It is dead, it is discarded, and along with it there goes a breakup of the etheric body. But we survive in the astral body, and when we survive in the astral body, we enter the astral world, we move around, we find our compartment, our scenario there, and we live out a life, some say, of about 30 years, depending on the population of the earth and many other factors. And so you can see that if there is a simulation of death through heart attack or through stroke or through an accident in the hospital, and the physical body cannot hold the astral, then it will tend to move out into the astral world. Now, the astral world has different vibrations. The highest vibrations in the astral world are on the periphery of the astral world. And there you will find the heaven states of humanity, whether Christian or Muslim, whatever they are, they exist on the periphery of the astral world, where the vibrations are high. The vibrations lower themselves. They drop and drop and drop, and people, according to their spiritual vibration, exist in these different planes with their compartments. Some of these vibrations are so low that they go below the level of the earth and give credence to the Catholic proposition of a hell state, coinciding with being below the level of the earth, with the volcanic conditions there, fire, and all these so-called demons with forks. You must remember that the astral world today is not like it was 400 years ago. Under the influence of the Catholic Church, there were demons and devils and men forking you into the fire and so on. Those concepts of medieval times are gone. Today, the astral world reflects the people, the humanity, the emotional nature of humanity as it is today. Nevertheless, there are these regions, and of course, many of you were introduced to them in the film called Ghost. Who saw Ghost? Anybody see the film Ghost? Yes. It changed your lives, didn't it? Changed your lives. It was so close to reality. And I approve of the film because it was certainly sneaked from my book on the matter. The plot was not the plot, but the scenarios were taken from my book. I didn't get any royalty for it, but certainly very valid indeed. Very important film. I wish it would come back again and I could get more people to see it. So now we're beginning to get the feel of the astral world, and the proposition here tonight is that some people are forced out of their physical bodies by trauma, car accident, whatever it is. You're forced out of the physical body and you find yourself in the astral world. And before they can bring you back into life, you have an experience. We'll talk about that in a moment. So this is the astral world, and this is the astral body. And now you'd say, well, where have you got evidence for that? Well, there's a lot of evidence indeed, but I'm going to choose two famous people who had an out-of-body experience when they were near to death. The first was the extraordinary individual called Professor Carl Jung, the great psychologist who most of us know of, a person who understood the human body intimately and could not have made mistakes. What he said was that in 1944, and you can read about it in his books, in 1944 he suffered a heart attack in Basel, Switzerland. And the doctors put him on the operating table and tried to revive him. He said while he was dead, clinically dead, he left his body. He said he left his physical body behind and entered another world. He said that he was so high above the earth that he could see the Red Sea, north of Africa, and he could at the same time on his right-hand see the Malabar coast of India. He could see both these structures, so high up was he above the earth. He calculated later through vectors that he must have been 1,200 miles above the earth in order to have seen both these structures. The doctors tending to him injected a camphor drug into his heart muscle. The heart became irritable, began to beat again, and Jung was pulled back into his physical body. The testimony of an eminent gentleman of science. You can read about it for yourselves. Some of you may be aware of a man called Terry Packer or Kerry Packer in Australia, perhaps the best known Australian. A few months ago he had, I believe it was a car accident, and reported an out-of-body experience. A man who had never even dreamed of anything but material form, yet he had an experience. Sometimes there are unusual variations of this out-of-body experience. Let me give you another example. We maintain in the esoteric that you can be instructed while you're out of the body, that you can meet high beings who will tell you things that will change your life. I'm going to give you an example from the life of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill. The years just before the war, when he needed an experience like this, God knows. This is what he had to say. He had been knocked down in an accident in the street in New York, and he was taken to hospital, and there he was given nitrous oxide and was cleaned up in the hospital. Whilst he was under the nitrous oxide, he said he left his body and he found himself in another world in which he was instructed and took part in an extraordinary experience. He said, "The sanctum is occupied by alien powers. I see the absolute truth and explanation of things, but something is left out which upsets the whole. So by a larger sweep of the mind, I have to see a greater truth and a more complete explanation, which comprises now the living element. Nevertheless, there's still something left out, and so we have to take a wider sweep and a wider sweep and a wider sweep." And so the process continues, he said, inexorably. He was describing the third initiation. If you read in Alice Bailey's work about initiation, you'll find a description of just that sort of experience there. And so we must not say to ourselves that this is the province only of cranks. On the contrary, ladies and gentlemen, when it was investigated to find out how many people had had a near-death experience, it was done by Gallup Poll. And Gallup Poll put out a questionnaire in North America. And in the questionnaire asked people about the nature of their out-of-body experience and what the vision was like and so on. Back came the reports, the questionnaires filled in, and Gallup Poll estimated that there must be something, and this was 1988, there must be something like 8 million people in the United States have had that experience. Today I saw, not today, a couple of days ago, I saw that this figure had crept up to, it was estimated, to 18 million people. An extraordinary matter. Not just one rare instance like Winston Churchill's, but happening to everyday people and by the thousand. And the extraordinary thing about it is also that the experience is numinous. And by numinous we mean that it is associated with religion. And it is a numinous condition that enables the person to be affected by the energy of the numinous, meaning religious energy. And the characteristic of numinous energy, apart from the fact that you have experiences and you give off energy from your aura that is not usually there, is that people catch on to it. People catch on to it, and the whole matter of out-of-body experience and near death has been linked to a similarity to a world epidemic. Now that's a religion. That's the emergence of a new religion. When a thing spreads like an epidemic, almost an element of hysteria about it. Don't expect to find the emergence of these religions unassociated with hysteria, unassociated with mysticism. Of course they're associated. How else can you describe them? There's no scientific language to describe what these states of being are. And so I say that there is this extraordinary evidence of people all over the planet, never mind the United States. I've lecture toured the earth many times, and I ask questions like I asked just now, have you seen the film Ghosts? And I ask people if they have out-of-body experiences and so on. And it's just the same all over the English-speaking parts of the earth. Now there's something that they all talk about, or nearly all of them talk about, and that is the existence of a tunnel. That when they are forced out of their bodies because of an accident or whatever condition, that they become aware, in most instances, of being in a tunnel-like structure, and that the light at the end of the tunnel is an effulgent light. It is immense, immensely bright. And they start to move up the tunnel in different ways, different manners. Some of them record vibrations, heavy vibrations, light vibrations. Some of them talk about the tunnel walls being rippled, and so on. What is this phenomenon? Well, history records something of this tunnel-like structure given out by many different individuals. During the last war, the World War, there was an immense amount of a low-quality emotional emission. Very, very low indeed. In the region of Europe, there were people who were stateless, millions of them stateless towards the end of the war. They had no homes, they had no state, they had no protection. There were millions in the concentration camps in Germany, suffering, never knowing what the next day was going to bring. Many actually being killed constantly, day after day, year in and year out. And so there grew up around the surface of the earth a great pall of the lowest form of astral substance, as if it was bursting out from below the earth, but was associated with the conditions of the war. And that substance had begun to appear in Bosnia, in the region of Bosnia where there is ethnic killing and so on. I noted the same substance. Perhaps some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you may know that in spiritualist circles, where there is an atmosphere of intense grief and trauma, that the emission from the auras of the people suffering can create a very, very low vibratory atmos in which phenomena can occur. And the bereaved family may be able to see an apparition of the loved one who has left them. And in this kind of atmosphere, all sorts of things can occur. Alice Bailey, after the war, talked about the astral world being fogged over in many parts, and how the great ones, the masters of the wisdom, who were at that time concerned with humanity, tried their best to clear this fog. Eventually, they concentrated in a particular region, and they poured their energies in from the mental world up here. They poured their energies into the astral, and she describes how it was like pouring distilled water into a muddied sink. But however, they were able to create a tunnel-like structure which broke through the different planes on the lower parts of the astral world and created a sort of resuscitatory channel. And when people are near to death, they very frequently, not always, they very frequently are able to approach this tunnel, enter it, and move up towards the light. The degree that they can move probably depends on the amount of spiritual energy they are able to assemble as to how far up the tunnel they can reach. That tunnel is there today. The existence of it is known, or has been known, for centuries. Plato describes the tunnel very clearly when he talks about his cave scene. I think we have enough time to do the cave scene, so let me tell you what Plato had to say about it. He said that mankind was like a group of individuals trapped in an underground cavern. This was the underground cavern. And from this cavern there was a tunnel, a pathway leading up to the upper world of sunlight. He said that mankind was like a lot of individuals chained to the floor of the cave, and that that mankind were like these men chained to the floor of the cave, and they could only look in front of them. Behind them, he said, perhaps there was a fire which threw their shadows onto the wall of the cave. And because they could see nothing else except their shadows on the wall of the cave, they eventually believed that they were the shadows, that they are the shadows, the two-dimensional shadows. And he said, what say if one of them was able to break his shackles? We call this, of course, spiritual unfoldment. Was able to break his shackles, and he was able to turn around and look towards that fire behind them, within them, or somewhere. He would be amazed to find that he was not just the shadow on the wall. He was something more dimensional than that shadow, and how he would be blinded at first by that light until he got used to it, and would be able eventually to break himself away from the wall altogether. And what, said Plato, would the effect be if this guy could be able to go up this long tunnel to the lighted region above? What an experience that would be when he suddenly came out into the lighted world and was able to see things like trees and flowers, and an incredible experience. And by analogy, of course, we're talking about ourselves, that some of us dare to break the shackles of this material world and seek a freedom which gives us more perception and beauty, which is what I'm talking about tonight in the transformative vision. And he describes how the man comes back again, finds himself seated next to his associate, and tries to tell him, I had an experience last night. I found myself in another world. This world that we see here is not the real world. The reality is many dimensions, such as people who come out of the near-death state, having had the transformative vision, talk about this other world and say how different it is. And if he nudged the guy and said, hey, I'll take you there tonight, you come with me, what would the other guy think? Think he was mad. Get away! Involved in your experiences. And that's the world as it is, according to Plato. You can read about it again in Dante's book about the Inferno and so on. Wonderful analogies in history referring to this cave. I want to now just mention to you what, before I go on any further, what the nature of the esoteric teaching about the death state is. What is the nature of the death state? According to esoteric teachings, our physical bodies are anchored to the whole process of life by two threads. The one thread anchors itself in the midbrain in the proximity of the pineal gland, and it is called the consciousness thread. The consciousness thread. The second thread anchors itself to the sinus node of the heart, the sinus node of the human heart, which is a region well understood, or not well understood, but well known to biologists. It's where you see the first pulsation of the heart in a creature. When you're looking at it in embryo, long before it's born, it begins to beat. There's a heartbeat seen in the muscle. And this is where we say that the life thread is anchored. We say that that life thread is sustained by a flow of neutrinos, but it is the other one of two threads, consciousness and life. We say that when we die, both of these threads have to be broken. Both have to be cut or broken before you can say that there is true death occurring. And some of the observations of the doctors and others who were observing the Israeli war and so on, was that these conditions of death were greatly affected by what was going on around them. You see, in some instances, in hospitals, you have the life thread is withdrawn. Something goes wrong. A loss of blood, massive hemorrhage on the operating table. The life thread is withdrawn. The patient is clinically dead, but they're put on a heart-lung machine, and the heart-lung machine keeps the blood flowing, the lungs breathing, and the life force is able to re-anchor itself. But that condition may lead on to cure, or it may not. Then you have other conditions in which consciousness is lost. Something, again, in a hospital where the body, the astral body, becomes detached from the physical, and this is often reported by nurses. The most frequent report of out-of-body experience is in this state, in a hospital, where the patient, unable to hold on to the physical body, leaves the body behind and comes to a position about 12 feet above it. And in this position, they are able to see what's going on in the operating theater. Usually they report it, the person reports it to his nurse, not to the doctor, but to the nurse, and the nurses believe that it's silly until the detail of the operation and the events that occurred in the operation are given by this person who was out of the body. And that has caused a great stir amongst the nursing profession. And there have been investigations made. The doctors, of course, don't know what it's all about, and they're anxious today to put devices up in the ceiling to detect some electrical phenomenon there that is making people conscious out of their bodies. The medical profession is almost totally unaware of the subject matter of the talk that I'm giving here tonight. If you have an out-of-body experience and you go along to your doctor and tell him what happened and ask him what it was, he's bound to say to you, well, don't worry, my dear, it'll get better. They just don't understand these things. And so we say that there are two chords. There are two chords involved, and both need to be broken for true death to occur. We say that certainly you should keep a body at least for 36 hours if you're going to cremate it. Keep it for 36 hours before the cremation is done, because there's always a chance that only one thread has been broken and another thread, the life thread, will come back into operation. The event that I read to you a little earlier is typical of this condition in which only one thread was broken. Now, what is this experience that people have when they are in the tunnel? I must just read one or two of these observations. People having the experience in the tunnel emerge from this vision, and almost universally they accept that there is life after death. No person having an out-of-body transformative vision escapes believing that there is life after death. Almost 80% of them believed that reincarnation was a fact after their experience. All of them lost their fear of death. They knew that there was no longer any need to fear death at all. Many of them abandoned their ordinary religious beliefs, believing that their religious beliefs and what they had been taught in church were not adequate to describe the conditions that they found whilst they were out of the body. Many began to adopt esoteric processes and employ them in their lives, like meditation, like learning to dream effectively, and so on. All of them said, there's no doubt about it, I've been in contact with God. And nothing could be said to them that would dissuade them from this belief. And so together, this makes up a transformative experience that is usually unparalleled in the person's life. What is the explanation for it? I don't know. But I'm going to tell you, from my 40 years of experience in this field and as a doctor, what I believe is the explanation. Socrates, when he was dying, or when he was about to take the hemlock, he was to take hemlock as part of the process of his execution. When he was in this state with his beloved pupils around him grieving, he asked his jailer, "What can I expect when I drink the hemlock?" And the jailer said, "You can expect first of all to lose feeling in your legs, and then in your arms, and eventually the life forces will be concentrated in the head and chest region." And if this is so, and there is a lot of evidence to show that it is, that the life forces start pulling out from the extremities of the body and concentrate in the region of the head and the heart, it means that there are chakras there called Sahasrara, the 1,000-petaled lotus, in the region where the consciousness thread is anchored. There is the heart chakra, which is located around the heart, especially where the center is applied to the sinus node. That's the life thread. And these chakras could be aroused suddenly with the concentration of life forces there to assist in this process of having a near-death transformative vision. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is the subject this evening. We're going to take a break of 15 minutes, and after the break I'm going to tell you of my own experience near to death on a battleground in Italy in 1944. And if there is time, unfortunately we have to be out of here by 9:30. We'll take questions and deal with everything. Take a break now. Thank you very much. Yes, are you all right? Ian's all right for sound? Earlier, I omitted to tell you about the work done by Dr. Morse and his colleague in New York two Orthodox medical men in New York who were struck by the number of near-death experiences of children in hospitals. And so Dr. Morse conducted research into the records of these children, all of whom had been close to death, and took down accounts of what they had to say about their near-death experience. The record was written down in a book called Closer to the Light, nice little edition, bestseller in the United States of America, reissued many times. Morse was amazed to find that these children gave similar accounts of what happened to them. Most of them had the out-of-body experience, and of those, nearly all of them had an experience of a tunnel. And in the tunnel, they're drawn to the light at the end of the tunnel, and they distinguish a figure there. And the figure is a Christ-like entity, an angelic being in white samite cloth, with beautiful, sweet, smiling face, beckoning them, and in many instances giving them advice, telling them that it was too soon for them to come into the inner worlds, that they must stay on the earth, that their parents, their family were grieving for them, and that they need to go back. That kind of advice was given. Obviously, the value of these 100 cases of children is that they could not possibly have been any collusion. They were in different hospitals, different ages, from about 8 to 14 and 15, and unlikely to have plotted their answers in collusion with each other. And so I regard that work of Morse as being very valuable. I don't believe we have any copies of the book. You have a few? There you are. It is your answer to the skeptics. You know, they can't get away from it. They can't get away from what I told you about Carl Jung, Winston Churchill. They can't get away from the accounts given by these young children of their out-of-body near-death experience. I'm going to tell you of my own experience. It'll take a little time because I can only give it in a slow monotone. It concerned me when I was 19, 20 years of age. Shall I do it again?
Please.
Sorry about that. I'm going to give you an account of experiences that I had when I was 19 and 20, serving with the British forces in North Africa and then in northern Italy. And the year was, in particular, were 1942 and 1944. I became aware as a young man in the Army, the 7th Armored Division, that I was beginning to have experiences that were inexplicable. I had joined the Army with just about half my class, the same regiment, and many of them were killed by the time that El Alamein came along. I had experiences with them. During the last hour or so of the night, before we were all got up for what was called Stand To, I found myself very unusually situated. It was what I regarded later as being very psychic, the hour or so before getting up, before waking. And during this period, I was visited wherever I was, in a dugout, lying out in the desert under the moon, I was visited by friends who had been killed. And it was totally lifelike. We would laugh and talk and clown around. And when it was over, I was amazed that they weren't still there. I would look around for them, thinking they were hiding, not knowing what the experience was at all. It was, of course, out-of-body experience on my part, they being in the astral world with very powerful, strong, unrequited astral bodies, seeking the expressions they would normally get in the waking, living state, but now dead, bound by ties of camaraderie to friends in our regiment. It shook me enormously. And even in those early days when, as you know, the British never won a battle before El Alamein and never lost a battle after El Alamein. Well, it was a very difficult time for us all. And I was greatly comforted by experiences that I had out of body at that time. Then we were put into tanks. We were infantry and we were put into tanks, and we went to Italy. And in Italy, I had a near-death experience. I was with my tank crew going down a very narrow road on the side of a cliff, scrub woodland all around, moving into German lines. We were reconnaissance. That meant we had to try and find out what was in front of us. Our regiment had lost 80 tanks in the last 4 or 5 weeks, and they were being knocked out because we couldn't see what was ahead of us. And the Germans had got our range exactly, having retreated the day before. They could put shells down upon us any time they liked. And so the procedure was that 2 volunteers would walk ahead of the tanks until they were fired on. And the fired on would reveal where the German gunners were. On that particular day, on July the 5th, 1944, just north of Siena, was walking down this road, very wary, with the officer of the troop, and we were ambushed. By that I mean that shells began to rain down on top of us, 4 tanks in a row, couldn't turn because of the narrowness of the road, couldn't go ahead because of anti-tank guns shelling us, and only able to go backwards. And with the large bombardment, the officer shouted to me to get back into my tank, which was a Sherman tank, and he jumped onto his Honey tank. As I'd jumped upwards onto the tank, a shell hit the tank and blew a compartment, a steel compartment, open behind the turret, and in the process I took about 30 pieces of shrapnel through me. It was not so painful then, but just as if I had been struck with a blow, a very powerful blow in the chest. The most dangerous injury was a piece of shrapnel that went through the chest and perforated the right lung. I managed to get into the turret. The turret was moving The crew inside were engaging the German gunners where they could see them. And meanwhile, the driver was trying to back out with all the other tanks to get out of the ambush. When I got into the tank, I fell to the bottom of the turret and lay there. And the turret was moving, and as it rotated, there was this, I remember it so well, there was the faces of my comrades in the tank, absolutely aghast, seeing me lying there, breathing through my chest and not through my mouth. And they maintained later that I had never opened my eyes. I'd fallen down there with my eyes closed, and I know certainly that I had been able to watch what was going on, lying there in terrible pain now. And of course I realized that I was in that state later, years later, that I was out of the body, partly out of the body. The body was in trouble, and I was able to see with my astral eyes what was going on in the tank. They managed to get out. I lost consciousness. They managed to get the tanks out, and a friend of mine drove me on the back of a dingo, which was a small armored car, drove me back to a casualty clearing station, and then on to Orvieto, where the main casualty base was. It was in a church. The casualty station was in a church. The church is still there in Orvieto. And it was, I remember coming back into consciousness because of the strong flow of fresh air driving onto my face as I lay on the back of this dingo. Entering the casualty station was rather horrifying. There were hundreds of men there. There was a push on, and many of them dying, many bloodied and limbless. The whole of the first of the ground floor was taken up with them in indescribable pandemonium. And I was taken downstairs in the crypt where the dangerously ill were lodged. It was very dark down there, a few lamps here and there, and every time I stopped, people injected me with morphia. It was, I suppose, the kind of thing you did with a suffering animal. You just did the best you could for them. So I think I must have been injected several times with morphia. I was taken into the casualty station and cleaned up before midnight. It got dark, and then I went into a coma. And I kept about 3 o'clock in the morning, terribly painful, screams, people all over the place. I came back into consciousness several times. And I remember the orderlies, the medical orderlies, shouting to each other that a plane was flying up from Naples to evacuate walking wounded. And anybody who was walking wounded could go out to the plane, catch it if they could get out to it. And I had this stored in the back of my mind. And then I went off into coma again. And the next thing that happened was that I was partly conscious, and suddenly a tremendous force struck me. First of all, I heard 2 explosions seemed to be on the roof of the casualty station, and I thought, oh my God, they're shelling the station. But it wasn't that, it was just 2 crashes, and then I realized that this force had taken hold of me. And there was a force at the top of my head. I was lying on a stretcher. There was a force at the top of my head, and another force on my bare feet, and they smacked at the same time, or almost concurrently, with these two loud crashes, and a tremendous electrical shock impulse flowed through me, and I was jolted by it constantly for about 3 minutes. It was accompanied by brilliant light, a light brighter than anything in this room, 10,000 times brighter than the sun. It flowed through me, and I was quite sure, I was conscious, quite sure that anybody looking in my direction would have been able to see the whole area lit up by it. And the most wonderful thing about it was that it gave me a sensation of ecstasy. I'd never felt anything like it. I have had the experience in what we call in yoga samadhi, but I had never had such experience of ecstasy. And at the end of, I figured, about 2 to 3 minutes, it was gone. And at that moment, I felt marvelous, absolutely wonderful. No pain, no exhaustion, just alert and lying there. And at that moment, orderlies rushed down into the crypt with lights, shouting, "Walking wounded, planes here, walking wounded only." And I knew then, whether it was I was thinking it, I don't know, but I knew then that I had to get up from my stretcher, badly wounded as I was, with an awful lot of blood loss, blood pouring into my lung, of course, that I had to get up and I had to go out there and get on that plane. There was no fear of death. I just knew that that's what I had to do. And so I swung my legs off the stretcher, and I walked across that terrible walk it was, with all these kids like myself lying on the floor, sometimes bleeding, and so on, and got to the staircase up from the crypt, got out into the courtyard, and reached the plane. I was pulled into the plane. It took off almost immediately, crowded with men, wounded badly, but not, they would definitely survive anyway. They were not dangerously ill like I was. And within 20 minutes, we were in Naples. In the next half an hour, into the 92nd British General Hospital. And I went straight into the operating theatre, and was given immediate help. The main thing was to get the blood out of my right lung, 2 pints of it. And I think that my life was saved by that experience, and that it happened when the plane had landed, because it would be crucial for me to feel at my best to be able to get out there. Well, that experience changed me. I was invalided back to South Africa, where I had enlisted. I had friends, of course, returning. And although I went along with them and played up old Harry, by that I mean dancing, drinking, and all the things that kids do after a war, swearing never, ever to get yourself into the same condition again. But my life was different. I knew I had to do something with it. I knew that I had somehow or the other to find out what had happened to me, and also what was the destiny of those guys who had been killed and whom I had met in Italy and in North Africa and joked around with. And so my life was changed. I decided that a friend of mine, a buddy, had got me a job at an English company, John Dickinson, and so on. I decided I would go to college, and I worked during the day, went to university at 5 o'clock. I did lessons every night of the week. At 7 o'clock in the morning, I had history lessons and Zulu lessons and so on, and I got my degree, my Bachelor of Arts. By then it was 1949, taken me 3 full years to do it, part-time. And I was able to fashion my life after that. And I decided that, first of all, I would go into business and make money so that I could have for the rest of my days and seek out, probe phenomena, find out what it was all about. Well, the business, absolutely, I hated it. Commerce was just disgusting to me, the way that people acted in commercial life. And so I went into retreat, into a desert region outside Cape Town, all sand dunes, and lived there for 3 years and found myself. That's what I went there for. And I began to have these experiences again. And they were associated with meditation, associated with the kind of things that Winston Churchill experienced, in which your mind was expanded again and again, and you learnt breathing exercises, and you learnt out-of-body experience and how you could go to the edge of the astral world, and so on. And so my life was changed, and I'm sitting here today because of that experience, when I was closer to death than I have ever been in 74 years. And I wanted to share it with you because I want you to know that there is a reality there. Whether I'm talking about it, who has no axe to grind with you, whether I'm speaking the truth, or whether those 8 million people who contacted Gallup poll, we're all talking the truth. And there is an interpenetrating series of worlds, and I've only talked about 1 or 2 of these states, but there is the mental plane, there is a mental globe interpenetrating the earth, and there is a spiritual globe interpenetrating the earth, where great beings can be contacted, beings who have passed through their series of lives on earth and are there still helping us to manage this planet, which is in such a difficult stage of its development. And I am now very happy to answer questions. May I have a pause of a few minutes?
Yeah, we've got to pack up.
I'll take one question. The young man who has a fringe of hair around his face which is solar. We say he has a sun face. We mean that a sun face is Leo, and hair growing out from all around his face, like, yes, young man?
When someone kills themselves,
Suicide.
does the dead spirit, or the spirit of a person, can it walk into a body that's alive still?
I'll tell you what happens at suicide. When a person takes his own life, it means that he has not accepted the challenge which the higher self has produced for him in that life. He can't make it, he doesn't want to, incapable of facing this awful threat or challenge. And so he kills himself. And I had a friend who blew his brains out only a couple of years ago, who was esoteric. They enter the astral world, but they are very different from a dying person who is aged. People who are old, dying, are people who go into and out of the astral world many times before they finally discard their physical bodies. But this is not true of a young man who is killed in a car accident or takes his own life. Their astral bodies are still very powerful and vibrant and will not leave the surface of the earth and go into higher regions because they still have the desires that I spoke about a little earlier. There is not a philosophy or religion anywhere which supports suicide. Now, I'm distinguishing suicide from euthanasia, where a person may take his life because the body has no longer any useful function. It is close to death anyway through some disorder. The suicide, however, is put back into incarnation very quickly indeed, probably today within 10 years, and that's quick. Could be much, much sooner. And they are placed back into a condition, a body, an embryo, if you like, in which the same circumstances, perhaps in a different scenario, will be presented to them again. They'll have to face what they have tried to escape from, that challenge, by their suicide. So they are, and it's under the lords of karma who decide where, which body, in cooperation with the higher self, the immortal part of us that lives forever. And so nothing is gained by suicide. Nothing is gained at all. And the manner in which you take your life in suicide affects the conditions that you incarnate into in the life ahead. If you hang yourself, then the likelihood is that the method of dying will be associated with you in the life to come. And the association is usually expressed through what we call respiratory disorders, bronchitis, anything that reduces the capacity to breathe, as hanging does, occurs for the life in the life ahead.
Have you ever heard the term walk-ins?
Who?
Called known as walk-ins. People who possess.
Oh, I know. You mean walk-ins, yes. I thought you were talking about Hawkins, the scientist. Yes, I've heard of that, but you've had my explanation, and I'm sure their explanation satisfies
Very
them.
intelligent artist, and he jumped off the top of the building.
Stepped off.
Jumped.
You want me to tell you about the suicides that I know? It's more or less the same pattern. But the important thing to remember with suicide that nothing is gained. A man who was devoted to his wife, who died of cancer, he took his own life because he couldn't bear to live without her, believing that he would join her, and he did nothing of the sort. She was in a different part of the astral world, and he was in another part, and although he had taken his life to get in touch with her once more, that had not been possible through his suicide. And so his life had been wasted. Don't waste your lives. Always remember that many people commit suicide through wasting their lives. Do you know why you're here on the earth? If you know why you're here, then you can, of course, implement the purpose of your life. And that is what your higher self, the immortal part of you, wants to do. Wants you to implement its purpose for you in this life. You say you don't know what that purpose is. Well, you've learned a lot tonight and you can find out such things. But you have to do some work for it. You have to meditate. You have to serve mankind. You have to study the esoteric classics. Open yourselves up and the higher self will tell you what it wants you to do. There's nothing worse than... That's it. Thank you very much for coming along, ladies and gentlemen.